and hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're pleased to have Dr. Alan Rutberg presenting today, who's the director of the Tufts Center for Animals and Public Policy and a research associate professor in the Department of Comparative Pathobiology at Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Rutberg is trained as a behavioral ecologist, and he earned his PhD in zoology at the University of Washington, Seattle in 1984, carrying out field studies on the behavior of American bison and wild horses. After a stint teaching undergraduate biology at Vassar College and elsewhere, Dr. Rutberg joined the Humane Society of the United States, HSUS, as senior scientist for wildlife and habitat protection, where he served from 1991 to 2000. At HSUS, he initiated field studies of immunocontraceptive vaccines for the control of deer and wild horse populations, which he's continued since joining the Cummings School faculty in 2000. At Cummings School, he directs the MS program in Animals and Public Policy, teaches classes in wildlife policy, wildlife in captivity, and policy communication, and mentors graduate and veterinary student research and internships. So thank you very much, Dr. Rutberg. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan, and Ginny for organizing, especially as you always do, and do such a nice job of getting the word out on these kinds of things. So today I'm going to be talking about wild horse management on Western public lands and how that's going, and whether there might be some signs of hope. I will eventually get to fertility control for wild horses as part of the solution to the existing management challenges. But I want to start with kind of a story and lay the groundwork for the way I think about things. So in the mid-1970s, a manager for the Federal Bureau of Land Management, who I'll talk about a lot, approached J. Kirkpatrick, the fellow on the right there holding loading the syringe, with the concern that it might be helpful at some point to have an effective contraceptive to manage wild horses. And so he and his colleague, Dr. John Turner, on the left there, started a long odyssey doing research on wildlife contraception, in particular contraception on wild horses. And so in their early days, they spent a lot of time, probably in the field alone, thinking about what a contraceptive should look like for wildlife. And so they came up with this list, which they had been working on for a while, but published in 1991. And as you go down the list, you can see that some of the criteria are just about practicality, right? So it's got to be effective, it's got to be low cost, it's got to be easy to deliver, and sort of the baseline of it not having any significant health side effects, the safe and effective paradigm. But as you go down the list, you find some things that are founded on a different set or a larger set of ethics and values. The notion that it should be safe for use in pregnant animals, but also reversibility. So why should a contraceptive be reversible? If your goal is just to control populations, why is reversibility important? Why is it important that the effects on behavior and the lives of the animals involved be minimal? Why is it important that it not pass through the food chain, which was a problem with some of the earlier contraceptives? And what those criteria signal is that the life of the horse matters, not just in the context of it not getting sick, but in its ability to live its life on the range, at home, with minimal impact from the contraceptive. The notion of reversibility is both in terms of reducing the long-term effects on the horse, but also in terms of the health of the genetics of the population that you're looking at. If you sterilize an animal, you are allowing it to remain on the range, but you're taking it out of the genetic pool, and it no longer becomes an individual that can contribute to the health of the population. Likewise, no passage through the food chain. That's an ecological sensibility. That's about the health of the community, about the other predators that are present in the community. So there's a bunch of values that are in this list, which are kind of the foundation of all the work that we've done since then. Okay, so let's get into it. Public lands. Most people don't know what public lands are, but excuse me, they are mostly, almost entirely in the West, including Alaska. And they are basically land that was not claimed in the middle of the 19th century during the settler land rush, right? So the Homestead Act and some other acts made it easy for people to claim land in the West. Didn't necessarily belong to them, but that's a different story. And to make it their own by farming it and improving it in various ways. And if you did that, you could have the land. But there was a bunch of land left over, some of the land in the photograph there, that nobody wanted. Nobody claimed it, typically because it didn't have water, because it wasn't productive, it wasn't a good place to farm or live or run livestock. And so that is the public land. And the public lands are managed both by the Bureau of Land Management and by also the U.S. Forest Service. Same is true with the forest lands that went unclaimed, basically because they could not be harvested with the technology of the time. So there's a lot of public land in the U.S. I'll talk about that a little bit. There are various complications with the public land. Often you have a checkerboard pattern where some of it is privately owned and some of it is publicly owned, and that creates some management challenges. But that's kind of what it looks like. That's in Wyoming. So let's talk about horses and burros, wild horses and burros, at least briefly. They obviously have a long history here. Horses, the equids, evolved in North America and went extinct about 10,000 years ago, and were then reintroduced, at least according to the lore, by the Spanish and the English. Many of them went free and interacted with the indigenous people in various ways. And their numbers kind of went up and down over the years. And in the middle of the 20th century, they were not super valuable. And so they were being shot at, they were being harvested in cruel ways and dragged off to slaughter. And there was quite a bit of public outrage about that. And I don't need to tell that story, but it resulted in the passage in 1971 of the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Protection Act. And that act really did three important things. First, it made it illegal to kill, harass, or take horses off the public lands, horses or burros. It gave the BLM the job in the mid-1970s of figuring out where the horses were and drawing boundaries around the places where they were, and managing for horses finally within that boundary, within those boundaries. And they should be managed under that law in a thriving ecological balance with the land. So very nice language from the early 1970s. Not long after that, in 1976, the other big law that's relevant here, Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, known in the trade as FLPMA, and it did a bunch of stuff, but it basically is the organic act, the act that governs the management of the public lands. And for our purposes, the important piece of it is that for the BLM, and for the Forest Service, it established a multiple use and sustained yield mandate to serve present and future generations. And so the act allows or encourages logging and mining and grazing, as well as wildlife and recreational use, and in certain areas, wild horses and burros. So we have two mandates here, one of which under the Wild Horse and Burro Act mandates the the thriving ecological balance, and the other one is a multiple use balance, which invites lots of stakeholders and lots of uses into the land. And those mandates are not exactly compatible. So before I get into that, this is a map of the Western United States. The wild horses are in blue, heavily in Nevada. About half of the wild horses in the lower 48 are in Nevada. The orange ones, I believe, are burros. So these, losing this, that's a wild horse area. This is a wild burro area over here. And there's some places that actually have both. So the lands are, again, the public lands, the Forest Service and BLM lands are public lands in the West, some of which are occupied by wild horses. It's about 27 million acres, which is a lot of land. That's about 5.5 Massachusettses that are managed for wild horses. So we do have these conflicting mandates, right? And so for our purposes, the main conflict with wild horses and burros is livestock. And if the range is managed to produce enough food to actually grow cows, they will also be capable of growing wild horses and burros, which eat very similar things. So if you have a production mentality for cows, you're going to end up as a byproduct with a production mentality for horses. So anyway, the multiple use mandate and the Wild Horse and Burro Act sort of set up conflicts among all kinds of stakeholders. So on the one hand, they're the extractive industries, which includes livestock growers, but also timber and mining and oil and natural gas and all the other ways in which people exploit the public lands. There are wildlife conservation advocates who have particular positions about protecting wildlife, especially endangered species, but not only. Of course, species that are considered game species that are hunted have a stake in this. Recreational users, which includes hunters, but also includes people who ride RVs and camp and hike, bird watch, and all those other kinds of things. And then the wild horse and burro advocates, who are focused on the protection of the wild horse and burro herds on the public lands. And it's kind of a fractious group, and there are lots of different philosophies that are followed by different wild horse and burro advocates, and they range from sort of non-interventionist, we should leave the horses alone viewpoints, to seeing horses and burros as actual resources, which could be used in various ways. And so there's a whole range of views, and all these people have strong interests in how the public lands are managed. Let me talk a little bit about livestock. So, as I said, there are about 27 million acres of BLM land that's open to wild horses and burros. There's 155 million acres that are open to livestock raising. So there's a lot of cows out there. There is the BLM is dealing with a 200-year history of overgrazing, right? Because until 1934, when Congress passed the Tailored Grazing Act, it was pretty much the free range. It was the open range, and anyone could graze as many cows and sheep as they wanted on the range. And so that was not conducive to protecting the resource in any way. Anyway, the Congress first decided in 1934 that you needed a permit to graze livestock on public lands, and set up a system where the BLM and the Forest Service will give out livestock permits to folks who live nearby, mostly, or at least have land holdings nearby. So we've got that history of overgrazing. We still have a fair bit of use. At the same time, the Western environment is subject to, as we now know, and it's becoming even clearer and clearer, severe periodic droughts and fires. So often you would have a stage where you've got 3 or 4 or 5 wet years when there's lots of grass and everything does well. And then you have 3 or 4 or 5 years where everything dries up and the grass all dies and the animals there really struggle. And of course, climate change is worsening all of that. So there are also some internal challenges to BLM wild horse management. So the program really is a national program. They need to be thinking systemically about how to regulate numbers on the land. But authority typically runs not through a wild horse program, but through a hierarchy that goes through BLM directors, state directors, who have lots and lots and lots of other concerns, including grazing and mineral use and timber cutting and all kinds of other issues. As it happens, most of the scientific, the veterinary, and hands-on work is contracted out by the BLM. There's not much internal either scientific or veterinary expertise, and so this can introduce other people's agendas that are external to the agency. And of course, as we know, with everything that has to do with the federal government, Congress changes its mind about things, the executive branch changes its mind about things, so funding is inconsistent, direction can be inconsistent, and of course can change rapidly with turnovers of administration and turnovers of control of Congress. And finally, like most things in the world, the agency has a culture that resists change. People like doing what they do, and it's hard to get them to change. So 4 challenges here in terms of wild horse and burro management. So we have the conflicting land use mandates. We have the thriving ecological balance concept versus the multiple use concept, which can sort of be balanced, but it tends to lead to cracks. Lots of fractious stakeholders who have really different philosophical and economic positions, all of whom under the multiple use mandate have a lot of interest in the land and have different interests in the land and the horses and the wildlife and everything on it. We have a marginal and traditionally overused land base, the public lands. Again, remember that they became public lands because nobody wanted them to begin with. And then finally, we have internal agency obstacles. Excuse me. So what's been going on since 1971? So BLM set up these herd management areas where the horses were living at the time that the agency was challenged to set out some boundaries. And so what they do under the sort of multiple use, let's divide the pie mandate, is they set appropriate management levels, AMLs, for each herd management area, HMAs. So again, we're also hindered by all these acronyms. But so the idea is every so many years in a public process, they allocate a certain amount of forage to livestock, a certain amount of forage to horses, a certain amount of forage to wildlife, and then they make a decision about how many horses or burros or both the land can support. So the estimate since really the late 1980s, system-wide, is that the land can support about 27,000 horses. Is that reasonable? I don't know. And that's certainly a topic of discussion. But in any case, to maintain those appropriate management levels at each of their 170 odd herd management areas, they have traditionally controlled numbers by gathering wild horses and burros. They remove a bunch. They return the rest. And the ones that they remove are either adopted through the Adopt a Horse and Burro program, or they're stockpiled somewhere. They go somewhere. And so that has been the dominant management scheme since really the late 1970s, early 1980s. So again, that's very sort of an agricultural kind of model where we're producing horses and we're removing horses to maintain a number. So there's a math problem here. And the math problem is that horse populations increase their numbers under reasonably good conditions between 17 and 23% every year. Burros may be a little bit lower than that. But they the BLM has only figured out how to adopt out about 4,000 or 5,000 horses a year, and that's in a good year. It's been as low as 2 or 3, and certainly in the economic crisis and from 2009 and so forth, they couldn't even get that many out. So we're growing 20% of the population every year. We can adopt out maybe 4,000 or 5,000. And in 2001, 2006, the numbers on the range were pretty high, and the BLM came up with a strategy to remove enough horses to get down to a system-wide appropriate management level. And they came pretty close. They actually came pretty close around 2006. But the problem with that system, of course, is if you miss a year or two and don't keep pulling horses off at that number, the population recovers very rapidly, and you're behind the 8 ball again. And so, as of March, according to the BLM statistics, there are now 72,000 or more horses and 14,500 burros on the range. Again, 27,000 horses is what they're looking at. And for those numbers, if you've got 86,000 horses and burros on the range, and that's before this year's breeding season, and you assume a 20% growth rate roughly, you've got to be removing 15,000 to 20,000 horses every year just to break even. And again, you can only opt out 4,000 or 5,000. That's not a good situation. And so, of course, the result of that is that there are now about 55,000 formerly wild horses and burros in holding facilities, and Congress has taken notice. They have raised the amount of money they've been giving the BLM each year for the last bunch of years significantly. These are 2021 data, yeah. And what you see right away is almost 2/3 of the money that Congress is giving the BLM to manage wild horses is going into feeding and housing and vet care for horses in holding facilities. Some of which are, better than others. Some of them are sort of long-term pastures, but whatever, some of them are more confined. But the point is that 2/3 of the whole wild horse and burro budget is now going to take care of horses off the range. These horses that have been removed, but could not be adopted out because they were taking way more horses off than they could adopt. And so the rest of the program really gets short shrift here. So adoptions are getting 13% of the budget, and everything else they do, all the on-the-range work, all the monitoring of vegetation, all the counting of horses, all the other things they do only get about 1/5 of the whole budget. So that's a problem. So can fertility control help us get out of that mess, right? Because the assumption here is that wild horse herds are growing at 20% a year. If we could cut that down, maybe 10% or even 5%, it would take a lot of pressure off the whole program in terms of managing numbers. Okay, so as I sort of noted in my little prelude introduction, the BLM got interested in wild horse and burro contraception in the 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president. So a long time ago. Some of their sort of forethoughty people saw that there could be a problem and that removals might not be enough to manage the herds. And so actually it was my friends Jay Kirkpatrick and John Turner who started doing a lot of this work in the 70s and then into the 80s. And the early work focused on steroid contraceptives, which everybody knows about because they were developed in the 60s and are used for people. And so that seemed like an obvious choice, but for actual administration to wildlife has proved to be problematic for many reasons. Then in the 1980s, the BLM noticed that Turner and Kirkpatrick and their colleague Erwin Liu from the University of California, Davis, were doing some interesting work at Assateague Island National Seashore in Maryland, which also had a horse problem, as they saw it. very, very popular horses. They get 2-3 million visitors a year. Everybody loves the Aztec ponies. And so the interest of the Park Service was to control the numbers without harming the horses in any way, preferably without handling the horses in any way, to preserve the rather fragile barrier island plant ecology or broader impacts, which the horses were having quite an impact on, which you can actually see from that little picture of Jade about to dart a horse. So what happened at Assateague is Jay and John started using Irwin Lew's Porcine Zona Pellucida vaccine, which could be dart delivered, and discovered that it was extremely effective. And it was effective enough that the National Park Service decided in 1994 to actually manage their horses that way. And in the succeeding 25 years, they have relied on that as their management tool. So they've got foal numbers were dropped down considerably. The mare numbers, the wild horse adult numbers followed eventually, and they've met all their targets. But BLM saw that and said, hey, can we use PCP on these Western wild horses? So some of you have seen this slide before, but anyway, PCP is Porcine Zona Pellucida. It's what's called an immunocontraceptive vaccine because it is a vaccine, actually, literally, and works by harnessing the immune response to prevent fertilization. It's a naturally occurring protein. It's extracted from pig ovaries. It is targeted specifically at the protein that surrounds the mammalian egg, and that's that over there. And the zona pellucida is the protein to which sperm bind before they can enter the egg and fertilize the egg. So if you have a bunch of antibodies that bind to zona pellucida proteins, then they will prevent sperm from entering and block fertilization. And it's highly targeted. There's nothing else in the body that looks like zona pellucida. So in many ways, it sounds like a good vaccine because it's a protein, it biodegrades. If you eat it, it's destroyed in digestion. It's not bioactive in any way unless it is actually injected. And you give it to females. It essentially just blocks fertilization and doesn't affect other aspects of the physiology of the animal. The effects on natural behavior are still being explored, but they seem pretty modest. Inevitably, there are going to be some differences in behavior between females who have offspring and those who don't. But so far, it's not a dramatic impact. Now, the vaccine that was used on Assateague is we call native PZP. It's a liquid. It's an emulsion of the antigen, the zona pellucida, in an oil-based adjuvant. The thing about this that worked on Assateague and also works in zoos is that you need annual boosters. We're all very aware of the need for boosters right now. That's something that's sort of front of mind. And so, but for seasonal breeders like horses, once a year, they need another booster that's native PZP. So that's a little bit of a problem in the West. Just as a side, PZP is being used all over the place. It's been used on probably 100 species of zoo animals, mostly hoofstock. We've used it a lot on deer, wild horses. It's been used extensively in Southern Africa on elephants, where it also works pretty well. It's being used on bison on Santa Catalina Island in California. And so it has a wide range of applications, and we've now been looking at it for like 3 years. So we have a pretty good sense of what it does and how it works. So let's move out west. Okay, and so we've got this technology. We have this vaccine that needs to be delivered every year. So how do you get it into horses? How do you get it into wild horses? So darting is one possibility. There are some herds where you can get into darting range. That's Dr. Kirkpatrick at the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Sanctuary. But other possibilities include bait trapping, You set up a corral, you put a bunch of bait in it, you get a bunch of horses in, you close the corral, you dart them, you let them go. So that's pretty benign. The other way is helicopter gathers, which is the way that BLM has traditionally gathered horses in the West, which is not something people really love. So there's contention about this, but given how large some of these herd management areas are, talking about 100,000 acres and up, given how wary some of the horses are, this is Cedar Mountain herd management area in Utah. That's as close as I ever got to horses there. And they're all lined up looking at me. They're clearly about to run away. And so it's really, really hard to dart horses in a lot of these areas. On the other hand, the traditional helicopter gathers don't get people very excited because it's very stressful for the horses. It's very stressful for the people who do them, and they're expensive as heck. So they're not great. So the interest of the BLM then was taking this native PZP vaccine that requires boosters every year and to sponsor research that would develop a one-shot, multi-year vaccine. So there wouldn't be a need to access horses every year for contraception, which in the context of the horses they manage and the places they manage them on makes a lot of sense. The BLM joined with the Humane Society of the United States and with Turner, Kirkpatrick, and Liu in order on holding the events there in 1992 and started doing a series of field projects looking to see how PZP would work on Western horses and whether we could develop, a longer vaccine. And of course, the first trial, the animals were gathered by helicopter, they were hand injected. Again, not an ideal, but in some of these areas, probably necessary. So skipping ahead over about 10 years of research, in 2007, John and the research team had developed a vaccine that BLM named PZP-22. And PZP-22 consisted of that native PZP emulsion, the liquid, at 1 cc, and added to it were those little teeny pellets, control-release pellets, made of the same stuff that that dissolving surgical sutures are made of, and an adjuvant, and engineered the pellets to release the PZP and the other adjuvant at about 1, 3, and 12 months. And the idea here is to essentially simulate boosters, right? So they get the initial shot, the initial native PZP emulsion, and then they get at 1, 3, and 12 months, little booster shots. And the hope was that that would extend the effectiveness for multiple years. And we did a whole bunch of different studies, including the Clan Alpine one that's cited in that paper. It turned out that PZP-22 was pretty effective, that in fact, a single shot would give you somewhere between 1 and 3 years of efficacy. So maybe we're there. And so in 2008, I worked with HSUS, which had received a very nice grant from the Annenberg Foundation to look at the larger effects of PZP in Western wild horses, to look at the population effects, to look at the health effects, to look at the behavioral effects. And we had 3 study sites, one Cedar Mountains, which is the thing on top there. I think that's Cedar Mountains in Utah, Sandwash Basin in Colorado, which is on the bottom, and then Harita Mesa Wild Horse Territory, which is a U.S. Forest Service property in New Mexico, which is the middle picture. And that picture, I believe, was taken by Kat Carey, V14, who worked with us on that project. So we got some interesting efficacy results at Annenberg. We were able to show, both through work at Sandwash and work that our colleagues did in New Mexico at Jarita Mesa, that you could dart deliver PZP22. Couldn't use the same dart, had to use a different kind of dart that would inject the emulsion, the native PZP, and the pellet simultaneously, but they work. And so that's kind of cool that you can remotely deliver the PZP22. The primary efficacy, the first shot was a little bit variable in the Annenberg study, and there were some quality control issues with the pellet release timing, and the timing of the treatment was maybe not optimal at all the sites, but it was still effective for 1 to 2 years. But the other thing that we found out that was pretty notable is after boosting them, so they got PZP22 as primers by hand, and then 2 to 3 years later, we treated them again, either by dart or by hand. And that turned out to add another 3 to 4 years of effectiveness, right? And so what that means is that we have something that with 2 shots essentially can give you 6, 7 years of effectiveness, something like that. We also looked at population size. This graph is population size at Cedar Mountain in Utah. The horse numbers are the blue line. So there's some growth. There's some years where the growth is slow, some years where the growth is faster. Again, the normal population growth for cedars is between 20 and 20%. So, so that was pretty good. But the key point here is that following a series of gathers in 2012, where the vaccine was administered as boosters to the ones that have been treated in 2009, and new shots to the ones that hadn't been, we ended up with 70% of the animals treated and did indeed get the population growth rate in the following year down to about 5%. So we now know it can be done. What we also learned from Sandwash and from Cedar Mountains is that we can actually kind of predict the impact of fertility control on population growth. And I sort of came up with this fertility control index, which is pretty simple. It's the proportion of mares treated multiplied by the efficacy of the vaccine, which makes total sense. The more the mares you treat, the better the vaccine is, the stronger the effect is going to be on reproduction and population growth. And we produced a graph, right? So there's a line there that shows the relationship between that fertility control effectiveness and number of mares treated and rates of population growth. And so we can now kind of use this to allow the BLM and other wild horse managers to predict what kind of population growth they're going to see after a certain amount of effort, which is very nice. Great. Okay, and just to make sure everybody knows, we're not the only game in town. The vaccine Gonacon was developed in the late 1980s by the National Wildlife Research Center in Fort Collins, a branch of USDA APHIS. It's a GnRH-based vaccine. Rather than targeting fertility or fertilization specifically, as PZP does, it pretty much turns off the whole endocrine cascade that controls reproduction. It works actually in both males and females, but it's only been used in females for the most part. And there was a field trial done, which is ongoing in Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which has found some modest effectiveness in wild horses for a single administration, but they also saw a huge boost in effectiveness with a single booster. And so that game is also out there. And so, but the prediction of the impact of vaccination doesn't really depend on which agent you use, as long as you know what kind of efficacy you're going to get and what numbers you can treat. So, as always, the issue is access and funding and will. So, in order to get agencies, the BLM and the Forest Service, to use fertility control. So again, stepping back, they've been spending money on research for fertility control in wild horses since the 1970s, and that's still going on. So we're talking about a 40+ year research effort on fertility control. The question is, we now have 2 agents. We have PZP, we have grown a con. How do we get them to use it and use it effectively? That is, to use it effectively enough to actually make a dent in their wild horse management issue or their numbers issue. You need to get support from all those fractious stakeholders, or at least a big bunch of the fractious stakeholders. You need support from Congress, and you need money from Congress, and you need direction from Congress. But then you also need to get the agency implemented at the local and the national level. So the path forward was developed in 2018, I think, after a long negotiation process by some of the large humane and wild horse advocacy groups, talking at length to the utilization groups, to the cattlemen, and other folks, and the range management folks. And they came to sort of a political agreement where the utilization groups and the humane groups had enough common interests in getting the issue under control that both made some concessions. It's been widely criticized. All I will say at this point is that it may have broken a stalemate of advocates yelling at each other for 40 years. So it's not exactly the right plan, but it essentially got all the stakeholders on board saying, yeah, we need an aggressive program of contraception in addition to doing removals. And eventually we need to cut down the number of removals as well. So that's sort of the direction. With that support in hand from both major pieces of the humane and animal and wild horse protection community, Congress has gotten behind it. So Congress supports the aggressive use of fertility control to reduce the use of removals for wild horses. Okay, and this is appropriations language. This is from the language that the Congress puts into its money spending bills that tell the agencies how they want it spent. And here they're talking about a comprehensive and detailed plan for an aggressive non-lethal population control strategy. And they've had to fiddle with the words on this, and BLM has not done exactly what they wanted, but Congress is willing to give the agencies the money to get it done. So, question now, is there hope that with the stakeholders, with Congress aligned, that the BLM and the Forest Service can actually incorporate contraception in significantly enough numbers of animals that they can actually have an impact on population growth? Maybe. So gathering and removing still comes very naturally to BLM. They've been doing it for 45 years. It's really easy. I mean, it's not logistically easy, but as far as planning and contracting and so forth, they've got that knocked. And so it's hard to get away from that. But we do have an administration that's much horse friendlier than the last one. And so there's some encouragement from the top. But in order to really implement it, there needs to be kind of a rethinking of the BLM priorities. And at the local level, the impetus, the incentives has always been, let's get down to appropriate management level. So let's take off a bunch of horses and then we'll be close to an appropriate management level. So the reflex is always, let's remove horses and that will get us down to AML. But there need to be a different set of incentives set up. The local folks need to be incentivized in various ways, not just to reduce population size, but also to reduce the flow of horses and burros off the range. Probably the only way they can do that without wrecking the range is with contraception. And the other thing they need are long-term management plans. Long-term planning is understandably really hard for federal agencies because they're on budgets that only last 10 years or only last a year or two. And so thinking like 10 years ahead, which you have to do if you have to think about like administering boosters and things like that, is pretty hard. But maybe that ship can be turned around. So we're all working on it. Anyway, the bigger picture is this, right? So these are the public lands administered by BLM. We're actually talking about 245 million acres, which is what, 30 some Massachusettses. It's a lot of space. 50 some. And so horses are only on about 10 or 11% of those lands. And so, although the last administration spent a lot of airtime talking about wild horses being the existential threat to the public lands, they're obviously not. Most of the threats to the public lands come from other uses. And we probably need to get away from thinking about AML and thinking about land as a pie that needs to be divided in some way. We probably need some deeper thinking and deeper land reforms that will incorporate the wild horse problem, but also deal with some of these other threats, other utilization threats, not just from livestock grazing, but also from oil and mining and natural gas and timber cutting and all those kinds of things. So we need to think more about that kind of stuff too. All right, just want to thank a whole bunch of people. I've been doing this for a long time. There have been a lot of people involved. Of course, the late Dr. J. Kirkpatrick was a colleague for many years with me, John Turner, and with Dr. Liu. Science and Conservation Center, Billings, Montana, which produces PZP, and Kayla Grahams, who works at the SEC now, but worked for the HSUS when we were doing the Annenberg project and oversaw it, as well as the agencies who have helped us out. So thank you. If there's any time for questions, I have about 10 minutes left, I think.
Yes, we do have questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Rutberg. Let's see. First, we have a shout out from Kristen Mehmet saying hello.
Hi, Kristen.
Tuning in from Colorado. We do have a number of alums on today, about 6 at least.
Kristen worked with us on deer studies one year with me and Kaylee.
So for our first question, it was, how is it decided which herd members get the vaccine and which don't?
Well, there are a couple of different situations here. So with the National Park Service, which has been thinking about this for a long time, they had on Assateague a specific plan where they would contracept horses that they knew individually for their first few years, then took them off contraception for a few years until they had a fall, and then put them back on. That's one kind of scheme. Another kind of scheme is just give it to them randomly, and which maybe reflects more humility in terms of our knowledge of how to manage herds. For the BLM, they have different criteria, but they actually have not thought about that enough. And that really, I mean, right now it's their challenge is trying to get it into enough horses to make a difference. But they really should reach the point where they're thinking about how they pick horses for treatment.
Thank you. Okay, second question is, what is the importance of wild horses in the ecosystem, and are they native to North America or brought from Europe?
That's a great question. There's an argument about whether they're native or brought from Europe. The ones that we have now are almost certainly mostly the descendants of horses that were brought from Europe, anywhere between 100 and 350, 400 years ago. And so, but they've adapted very well to Western areas and a lot of other places. There are also wild horses in Australia, there are horses in Europe, they're all over the place, South America. But the peculiar issue about our wild horses in North America is that pretty much the whole equine line evolved in North America. And so they were here until about 10,000 years ago, when they were probably wiped out by a combination of climate change and people. And so some people frame the return of horses as a reintroduction. Your first question is probably more important, how they fit into the ecosystem. They are grazers, they are like livestock. they probably evolved in the context of the Great Plains and with bison and other native grazers, and so they have some role. They probably disperse some seeds, but right now they're in the West. They're in an ecosystem that's so disturbed. It's kind of hard to know what their natural role would be if they were there in like reasonable numbers with a complement of native species.
Another question is, what happens to the horses in the holding areas?
Well, some of them are put up for adoption. And again, with the understanding there's sort of a limitation on the number of horses that can be adopted out. And they have both short-term and long-term holding facilities. And if horses are not adopted, the long-term holding facilities, some of them are owned by BLM, and so they're sort of like big pastures. They're also now contracting with folks to let these horses out on their land. So they are managed. I think, my opinion is they're better off on their own range than they're going to be in any holding facility, but they're not. Sort of depends on your philosophy of what to do with horses. So they're okay under conditions of like human husbandry, but maybe not what they would choose.
Okay. Another question is, what has helped unify, incentivize, etc., these different involved parties?
Well, the livestock folks and the wild horse advocacy folks have been basically yelling at each other, saying the same things since the late 1970s, early 80s. And I think the fact that the numbers of horses kept going up on the range drove some urgency here. I mean, it's described as a crisis. Whether you think it's a crisis or not, I'm not sure. It may certainly locally be a crisis. There may be some herds that are genuinely at risk in terms of facing drought and starvation. But I think it's some level of desperation and frustration at the lack of progress and the inability of the agency to control numbers in a way that is good for the horses and also satisfies people who want to grow some cows and sheep on the land.
Thank you. Next question is PZP or Gonacon suitable for use on feral cats? This was from one of our alums.
Okay, unfortunately, PZP does not work on cats. That's been tried. Gonacon does somewhat. I think there's still some research that Julie Levy and other folks are doing with contraception, reversible contraception with cats. And there may be another agent out there that's useful, that's neither Gonacon nor PZP. Yeah, that's like, we wish it worked on cats. It doesn't work PZP doesn't work very well on dogs either. So, but there's some work that can be done on that.
Another question from an alum. What natural predators do horses have? For example, will the reintroduction of wolves in Western states have any impact on reducing horse numbers and restoring some ecological balance?
Also a great question. I don't think wild horses and wolves overlap anywhere right now. Cougars are effective predators, especially of foals, and places where cougars, mountain lions overlap with wild horses have really had an impact on wild horse population growth. The issue is that trapping and hunting of big predators is still a huge thing out west, and a lot of places, some places at least, where there might be natural predators, there aren't any because they're trapped or shot out, which is unfortunate. But there are probably also a lot of places where horses live that are just not productive enough to support a predator population. You know, some of those areas in Utah and in Nevada where it's just not very productive. You might not be able to support a viable cougar population. We'll see about wolves.
Okay. And let's see. Someone's asking if you would comment on the removal of horses in Colorado in September of 2021. Was that a herd that used contraception? If so, was it not enough? What more could they have done to prevent having to remove those horses?
Yeah, that's probably the Sandwash Basin herd. The last time contraceptives were administered, well, I take it back. We worked there 2008 through 2010. There's also been a very nice effort by a local advocacy and management group of volunteers that have been darting animals. But the fact is, as far as I know, those animals, that herd has not been gathered since 2008. So that's a really long time. And if we could reduce the frequency of gathers that much, it would probably be helpful.
How did you get involved in this field of work?
Oh, chance. So I was working on acetique in the 1980s, looking at mare behavior and looking at foal behavior, and I was by coincidence there when those folks showed up, when Jay and John showed up at the invitation of the National Park Service, and I sort of took them around, and it became clear, since I was really interested in foal dispersal, if they were going to come in and prevent all those mares from having foals, I did not have a research future there, and so I kind of switched allegiances and started working with them, and so that's, you know, since 1985 or 1986.
Let's see. How do you ID mares for boosters?
At the places that we've worked, that Kayla over there has developed enormous databases that actually have the records of individual animals. You probably don't need to do that. If you were actually capturing them and treating them, you could probably just put a small freeze brand on them to indicate they've been treated before, and then you would know that they needed boosters when they came in. But in smaller herds, you can track individuals. In really large herds, that gets to be a little bit more challenging.
So we're actually getting a bunch more questions, but we're running out of time, and they are good questions. So we are happy to reply to, and we'll share the answers with everyone who is registered and who is attending.
Yeah, I would be happy to respond by email or other means.
Okay. And do you have anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Well, everyone should stay tuned. The wild horse issue is really interesting, politically and logistically. But again, we need to be thinking more in terms of the public lands protection cosmically, and this idea that public lands are pies that need to be divided, and then we get to argue about the size of our respective slices. It's probably not a real productive way to look at it, and it has not been good for the land. So we may need to look for another way ahead. So thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate the group here.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Rutberg, and thank you everyone for coming. We hope to see you soon at one of our future events. And as always, please feel free to reach out to Tufts Center for Animals and Public Policy anytime with any questions or comments at capp@tufts.edu. And have a great day.